hope you can all hear me okay. If not, please do let me know. But let's get started. So my name is Leo, and I am a PhD student at Balliol College at the University of Oxford, studying classical languages and literature. I came to Oxford as an undergraduate in 2016 from a state school in North London. I had never studied Latin or Greek before, but I knew I was interested in learning about the ancient world from reading historical fiction as a teenager. Believe it or not, that is actually quite a common route into classics. Lots of people have never even heard of the subject before doing their A-levels, and some people study it for the first time at university. I was very lucky because my school offered classical civilization at A-level, but this is not a requirement to study classics at university. So if you are interested in this subject and you don't have it as an option at your school, don't worry. You can take the subject without any prior experience at most universities, including at Oxford. So just a little bit of brief background. I have been studying classics at Oxford for about 8 years now. While I was doing my GCSEs, I came to a taster day at Balliol College, actually, and I enjoyed it so much that I decided to study classical civilizations for A-level and to apply to university to study it further. I then did 4 years as an undergraduate at Oxford to get my degree in classics and decided to keep studying for a master's and, at the moment, a PhD. I'm now in my third year of PhD studies, and I am researching how ancient Greek theatre has been adapted on the modern South African stage. Although classics is usually understood as the study of the ancient world, lots of people also study the influence of classical antiquity on modern literature, cult, art, language, and society. In this workshop, I'm going to be introducing you first to what studying classics at Oxford can look like, and second, to give you a bit of a taster session on drama in the ancient Greek world, to get you thinking about classical sources and how we can use them. Hopefully, some of this will already be familiar to you from the documentary that I asked you to watch before this workshop. We'll take a look at some short extracts of text and visual sources, which are the kinds of materials you might be asked to interpret if you get called to an interview at Oxford or Cambridge for any humanities subject, classics, literature, history, philosophy, etc. Firstly, most of you have probably actually encountered some form of classics, although you may not have realized it. If you've ever read any historical fiction like the Roman Mysteries, or books based on mythology like Percy Jackson or The Song of Achilles, that's classics. If you are interested in Greek and Roman mythology, the stories and the gods, that's also classics. You've probably looked at the ancient Greeks or Romans in primary school. These are all aspects of classics. It's a subject that appeals to those who enjoy the humanities in general, with a specific focus on the ancient world. So if you enjoy reading literature, learning languages, finding out about how people think and how lives varied in different cultures, studying archaeology and art history, classics could be an option that you might want to consider. It is an immensely broad subject, which allows you to consider evidence from the distant past through a variety of different academic lenses. At other universities, it might be called classical civilizations, classical studies, or ancient world studies. The period which falls under the umbrella of classics ranges from about 1500 BCE to the 6th century CE, which is a huge remit. Within that, there is a massive range of literature, history, thought, and culture. You can study the earliest writing in the Greek world, which includes a script that hasn't yet been deciphered, called Linear A, from ancient Crete. You can study Roman military history during the imperial period, or the philosophical thought of Plato and Aristotle, or mosaics from North Africa, or how ancient Greek tragedies have influenced modern literature. The list goes on. Although our focus tends to be on Greece and Rome, it is also possible to study other ancient civilizations like Egypt, Persia, and Roman Britain. You can choose to specialize in one type of field, like history or literature, or you can do a bit of everything, which is what I ended up doing. Because there are so many different ways you can study classics at Oxford, the discipline is divided up into 6 different pathways. The biggest course is called Literae Humaniores, which is a fancy Latin word for human literatures, and it covers all of the aspects of classics. However, many students choose to take a more specialized course, and there are 5 of these: classical archaeology and ancient history, ancient and modern history, classics in English, classics and modern languages, and classics with Asian and Middle Eastern studies. In Literae Humaniores, you get the chance to study the ancient languages, literature, history, and archaeology of ancient Greece and Rome, as well as philosophy and linguistics. You can apply to this course with or without knowing Latin or Greek already. This is probably the most flexible area and probably the most popular course as well. You can choose to really specialize in an area of your choice, like Greek literature or philosophical thought, or you can dabble in a bit of everything. For those who are more interested in archaeology and ancient history, Oxford has a special course dedicated to these branches of classics. This course allows you to dive into the material and historical cultures of the ancient worlds, from studying Greek vases to Roman amphitheatres, written histories, inscriptions, sculptures, and much more. For those who really want to specialize in history, both ancient and modern, we offer ancient and modern history. This takes the long view of the world's history, from the Bronze Age Mediterranean right up to global history in the present day. Then we have 3 options known as joint schools, in which your course is split between 2 faculties or schools. For those who really enjoy the literary side and don't want to give up studying modern literature, you can study Greek and Latin literature and languages alongside literature and English right up until the present. A similar option for those who are keen on linguistics is classics and modern languages. Oxford offers a range of modern European languages that you can study in conjunction with classics. The current options are Czech, French, German, modern Greek, Italian, Portuguese, Russian, and Spanish. Our final course is Classics with Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. This course gives you the chance to pick from a range of exciting languages like Sanskrit, Akkadian, Hebrew, Arabic, Turkish, Persian, Egyptian, and many more. This option is perfect for those who want to explore antiquity beyond the bounds of ancient Greece and Rome. For the specifics of these degrees, which I'm not going to go into in this workshop, you can find all of the information on the Oxford Classics undergraduate admissions website, the link for which will be at the end of this presentation, or you can simply find it by Googling Classics at Oxford and it'll pop right up. But now for the second and more interactive half of this workshop, I want to give you a taster session of what studying classics can be like, including showing you the range of materials we draw upon and how we can think critically about the ancient world. The topic for this workshop is something that I specialize in, theatre and drama in ancient Greece. And there are a few key questions I want you to consider throughout the workshop. Number 1, how did theatre differ in ancient Greece from theatre today? 2, did ancient theatre function purely for entertainment purposes, or did it have a political, educational, and/or religious role? How was it informed by myth, history, politics, and philosophy? And how did it, in turn, inform myth, history, politics, and philosophy? Thirdly, what are our sources for ancient theatre, and what do they tell us? We're going to look at a few examples today. Starting with why it's worth studying Greek drama. Do you think that theatre today has any relation to the ancient world? And for this, I want you to type yes or no into the chat, and let's see if more people agree or disagree. So I'll give you a minute to do that. No, yes, 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 yes. Yes, yes. Ooh, lots of yeses coming through. One more no. Yes. Another no. Lots more yeses. Okay. One big no from someone. Okay, so it looks like maybe 2/3 agree and 1/3 disagree. Let's see by the end of this workshop whether your opinion has changed or not. To start with, lots of the terms that we use in theatre today come from the Greek and Roman language and structure of theatre. Although there are noticeable differences in ancient and modern theatres, you can see where our theatre comes from. Some obvious differences include the fact that Greek and Roman theatres were open air, built into hillsides. This meant that plays could only be performed in the daytime to make the most of the natural light. You can see also that they have a very specific circular design in order to maximize the natural acoustics in an era without microphones or speakers. The design of the seating actually gives us the name auditorium, from which we take that from the Latin verb audio, to hear. Another term we still use is chorus, which describes both the song and dance performed by a group and the performers themselves. The word theatre is actually Greek, derived from theatron, which is related to the Greek verb to see, theao. Scenery comes from the word scenare, the backdrop behind the stage, which depicted the setting of the play and contained dressing rooms within the building. That's where we get the phrase behind the scenes from. Finally, orchestra is a term that in ancient Greek theatre referred to the circular pit where the chorus performed, but is now most commonly associated with the musicians who play live music, often in an area in front of the stage, so in the orchestra. One of the most famous and best preserved Greek theatres is in Epidaphros in the south of Greece. No matter where you are seated in the auditorium, the acoustics are so good that you can perfectly hear the drop of a penny or the rustle of fabric of an actor standing in the orchestra, and you can see a person standing right in the center in this photo. In antiquity, this was an important theatrical and religious site. Behind the theatre are the remains of a sanctuary dedicated to the god Asclepius. Does anyone know who Asclepius was, also called Asclepius? If you know, write it in the chat. Someone doesn't? Someone else doesn't? He's quite an obscure god, but he was very important for the ancient Greeks. The Romans called him Asclepius. Oh, good guess, god of entertainment. He actually wasn't. That was a different god who we'll talk about in a minute. Asclepius was the god of medicine and healing. People would come from all over the Greek world to ask for healing at this sanctuary. But then you might ask, why might a theatre have been built right by a sanctuary? What was the relation? And I can see, yes, someone's put in the chat medicine and healing. Oh, one person did know. Good job. What's the connection between healing and the theatre? Well, it might seem a bit strange to us today, but the Greeks believed that while medicine healed the body, theatre healed the soul, which is something that they believed strongly in, so that the two complemented each other. If you made the journey across Greece to say, come get your arm healed, you should also get your soul cleansed by immersing yourself in some drama. The Greeks believed that the theatre, especially tragedy, cleansed or purified the spirit in a process called catharsis, which would refresh actors and spectators alike. The idea is that the plays were so powerful, you would undergo an almost out-of-body experience. Playwrights since antiquity to the present have been inspired by the ancient Greek recipe for a successful tragedy. Aristotle, an ancient philosopher, summarized this model as what we call the three unities: unity of time, place, and action. This essentially means that the story takes place in the span of one day, in only one location, and with one main plot. We can still see the influence of the three unities in some of the most famous playwrights ever, such as Shakespeare, who you've probably read a bit of in school. In fact, Shakespeare took a lot more than this from Aristotle and the ancient Greeks, and he even borrowed entire plots sometimes. Before we dive into looking at some examples of ancient drama, I want you to think about what are the key features of modern comedy and drama. What do you expect to see when you go see a play? This can be anything from the type of characters you might find, plot devices, cliches or themes, even costuming. So now I want you to take 2 minutes to discuss this with the person sitting next to you, and after that to type your ideas into the chat. So I'll let you discuss amongst yourselves now. Okay, we've got lots of good answers flooding into the chat. So our first one that comes up is a comedic or dramatic monologue in a section of the play. Absolutely. One of the most integral portions of both a comedy and a tragedy is to have a long speech or soliloquy by one character, sometimes addressed to the chorus, sometimes directly to the audience. Emotional plot changes, absolutely. We find this probably more in tragedy than in comedy, often at the realization of something horrific. Dramatic irony, says Christopher, and that's absolutely correct. Dramatic irony tends to arise when the audience recognizes something that the characters within the play can't yet see. A hero, definitely. We have both a comic and a tragic hero. And a couple of people also said a villain. That's a good point. We definitely find that in modern plays, but we'll see if ancient tragedies and comedies had a villain. It's not so common in the ancient world. A couple of more points that came in. The protagonist makes a false or a bad step. Absolutely. And this is really integral to Greek tragedy in particular. And we call it a hamartia or a fatal flaw, often the result of a misunderstanding or a lack of knowledge. Someone also said haiku. That's interesting. We don't find this in ancient tragedy or comedy, but there may well be some modern ones that do use haiku. Romance is another one that came in. We do find this, yes, I think more so in ancient comedy than in ancient tragedy, but it's definitely an important feature of modern genres. Metaphor and realism are also really good. Some literary devices, character development and arc, messages to the audience, a big fight scene between the hero and the villain. Yeah, actually, we'll talk about this in a moment, but in ancient tragedy, violence could not actually be shown on stage, despite being quite important to the plot. And we'll talk about how the Greeks got around that. Down to earth characters, yes, but we also find a lot of characters who are maybe a bit too hubristic or too arrogant, and they tend to get punished for that. Morals and messages to the audience, absolutely. I think a lot of modern drama has that in common with ancient drama. Journeys, adventures, romanticism, and quests, all really good points. Foreshadowing, another really good literary technique that we find a lot. A climax, absolutely, normally comes towards the end of the play. It could be catastrophic or fantastic, depending on the genre. Excellent. So I assume from this that a lot of you have been in or seen a play, and then you're actually quite familiar with a lot of the key tropes that you'll find in ancient drama. So the question that we're going to think about now is, what makes a good ancient tragedy? A lot of our ideas about Greek drama come from Aristotle, but we can also summarize based on the 33 surviving ancient scripts. Aristotle claims that a good tragedy stirs two key emotions in the audience, pity and fear. To achieve this, most tragedies follow a broad pattern. The main character, the tragic hero, is generally a good person, usually a man, but sometimes a woman, who has, for the most part, good intentions, but makes some kind of mistake. Their behavior displays what we call the fatal flaw, the hamartia, which is typically an error in their judgment. And this fatal flaw causes them to make a grave mistake, which leads to a reversal of fortune, the peripeteia, which is literally a turning around. This reversal of fortune has catastrophic consequences for the hero and those around them, and they realize their mistake too late to undo its consequences. The character then learns through suffering, and the audience learns with him or with her or with them. All of this occurs in one continuous plot, in just one city, and in the course of one day. If some of this sounds familiar from modern drama, there were also important differences. Greek shows used a maximum of 3 actors, often less than that, who shared all of the characters, and it was not uncommon for one character to be played by different actors throughout the drama. Think about how weird that might be if you have a character come on with a mask and then suddenly they have a different voice from what you were expecting to hear. It could be quite jarring. The chorus was fixed at 12 members, later 15, who were always performed by men, just like the actors, although they could play female characters. Again, that could be quite strange. There were a few peculiar rules that the playwright had to follow. Death could never be shown on stage, as this was considered sacrilegious, and instead it had to be reported by a messenger, who would appear on stage to narrate in great detail the most horrifying action. This may sound a bit anticlimactic, but considering how big the auditorium was, those seated at the very back wouldn't be able to see the characters' movements on stage very clearly, so this may actually have been more effective. It was more or less a rule that the plots had to be mythical and set in the past, and not refer to contemporary events. We know that one or two playwrights did dramatize recent defeats in battle, and were actually fined by the city for reminding the audience of these upsetting moments in their history, and the plays were banned from being performed again. Finally, the plays were only performed once, rather than running for weeks or months like they do today, so all of that work went into just one performance, weeks or even months of training. This is because they were performed as part of a religious and civic competition that occurred annually. Only 3 tragic playwrights could stage plays at a time, and they had to produce 3 different tragedies, all performed in one day. There was one day of the festival dedicated to comedy, in which 5 playwrights would stage one play. And because all the theatres were open air, they were performed in the daytime, starting very early in the morning and ending at sunset. What about the purpose of drama? It was quite different from what we today think drama is meant to do, to entertain. In ancient Greece, plays are usually performed at religious festivals in worship of the god Dionysus. Does anyone know who Dionysus was and what he was god of? If you do, type your answers into the chat. God of wine, absolutely. You often see him depicted with grapes and carrying a glass of wine. God of partying, yes, he was a pretty fun god. Parties were held in his honor. Anything else? God of entertainment, says Oliver. Absolutely. And specifically for our interests, he was the god of theatre. We also have an answer that says dolphins. That's interesting. There definitely are myths that involve dolphins, and I think Dionysus, but I'm not sure if he was god of them. God of twins. There was a Roman god called Janus, who was the twin god. Not necessarily Dionysus. God of playful clouds. Oh, I'm intrigued to hear more about that. He was definitely god of all things playful, having a good time. So parties and theatre. It was an annual festival in his honor held at Athens, which was named after him. It was called the Great Dionysia, or the City Dionysia. This is where processions and sacrifices were made, but it's also where plays are performed. The whole festival lasted about a week and was packed with shows and celebrations. In the build-up to the performances, there were grand parades in honor of Dionysus, libations poured, sacrifices made, and honors proclaimed for distinguished members of the city. The performances filled the last 4 days of the festival, and the plays were entered into a competition, judged by a panel of jurors. Because there were such big festivals attended by a large chunk of the population, not just locally from Athens, but from all over Greece, it was believed that playwrights had to use this platform to educate the citizens. Many tragedies in particular have a strong moral undertone, just like some of you pointed out in the question earlier. Generally, ethics are demonstrated by negative examples in tragedy. A mythical hero is shown trying to approach a problem in the wrong way, and the audience learns from their mistakes. This idea that tragedy was educative is parodied by the comic playwright Aristophanes in one of his plays called The Frogs. In this comedy, Dionysus goes down to the underworld to bring back a dead poet, who he hopes will be able to fix the corrupt state of Athenian society. In a debate between 2 famous tragic playwrights, Aeschylus and Euripides, the characters discuss what makes a good playwright. Aeschylus asks, "For what should a poet be admired?" To which Euripides responds, "For cleverness and good counsel, because we make men better citizens of their cities." A little later, when discussing what is morally appropriate to put on stage, Aeschylus says, "It is necessary for a poet," and by poet he means playwright really, "to conceal wicked elements of myth, and not put them on stage or teach them. For little boys have teachers who instruct them, but young men have poets. Therefore, it is necessary for us to pronounce only noble things." Even though this is satire, it tells us a lot about the popular perceptions of the purpose of drama in ancient Greece. To focus on one specific example, we're going to take a look at two short passages from a tragedy called The Medea by Euripides. As you read this passage, what impressions do you get of the protagonist? Does she sound like a modern woman or not? After we've read the passage, I'll give you a few minutes to discuss amongst yourselves, and then I want you to type what you think the story is about into the chat. So at this point in the play, Medea says, "Of all creatures that have life and intelligence, we women are the most wretched. First, and at an exorbitant price, we must buy a husband and a master of our bodies. And this is the greatest question, whether we take a bad or a good husband. For divorce is discreditable for women, and refusing a husband is not possible. And when a woman comes into the new customs and practices of her husband's house, she must somehow become a prophet, since she has not learned this at home, namely, how she shall best serve her husband. If, after we have spent great efforts on these tasks, our husbands live with us without resenting the marriage yoke, our life is enviable. Otherwise, death is preferable. A man, whenever he is annoyed with the company of those in the house, goes elsewhere and thus rids his heart of its boredom by turning to one of his friends or companions. But we must fix our gaze on one person only. Men say that we live a life free from danger at home, while they fight with the spear. How wrong they are. I would rather stand 3 times with a shield in battle than give birth once." So take 3 or 4 minutes to discuss this passage in pairs or small groups. Then I want you to tell me in the chat what you think this play is about. And do you like the character of Medea? Okay, we've had lots of good thoughts come into the chat. So some of the first ideas are that the play is about how being a woman in ancient Greece is unlucky and difficult, and there's a lack of freedom. And that's absolutely correct. What she's listing are the realities of women in ancient Greece, who are very much bound to be subservient to their husbands or to their fathers. Someone puts it very nicely here, saying that she feels trapped because she is a woman in a patriarchal society, and that's absolutely correct. In this passage, she's talking to a group of local women, and she's trying to get their sympathy by talking about the shared struggles that they have. A few people think that she's not a very sympathetic character, and that she sounds a bit obnoxious. And that's a good point. We'll talk a little bit later about whether you like the character of Medea or not. She's a very polarizing figure. Um, we also have a really good point that the play is written by a man and performed by men. So how would they understand the mindset of a woman? That's a really good question. Reading this today in the 21st century, does she sound like a feminist? What do you think? Type yes or no in the chat. You got one yes, another yes, a couple more yeses, lots of yeses. Pretty unanimous so far. Um, and that's really interesting, which raises all sorts of questions. Did feminism exist in ancient Greece? Not necessarily as we know it. Could men be feminists? Are men feminists? If you didn't know who the playwright was, would you guess that this was written by a man or a woman? A couple of other points that came into the question that were very nice is that our speaker in question subverts the expectation of how a Greek woman is expected to feel. Um, Also about lack of choice, being unable to divorce from a bad marriage, and feeling restricted and trapped. So let me tell you a little bit more about where the speech comes from. Um, it's from a play by Euripides, performed in 431 BCE in Athens. Now, Athens was not the capital of ancient Greece, as Greece didn't necessarily have a capital, but it was the cultural center. It was also one of the most oppressive societies in terms of gender imbalance. The story is based on a famous Greek myth. Medea, who's a woman from a non-Greek land in the present-day Black Sea, or roughly equivalent to modern Georgia, marries the Greek hero Jason and runs away from her home with him to live in Corinth. Jason makes a deal with the king of Corinth to marry the king's daughter and abandon Medea and their two sons. Enraged and heartbroken, Medea plots to ruin Jason's life by killing his new bride and her own two sons. Although it pains her to do so, Medea fulfills her aim and escapes to Athens. Throughout the ages, Medea has been interpreted as everything ranging from an embodiment of pure evil to a feminist icon. In fact, during the suffragette movement in the early 20th century, this speech was chanted at feminist meetings as it was seen to articulate many of the injustices that women in early 20th century Britain were still facing. So based off this passage, what is one word that you would use to describe Medea? Type your answers into the chat and then I'll read some of them out. Bold, that's a good one. Conflicted? Yeah, absolutely. Or is she conflicted here? She definitely is so later, if any of you are already familiar with the play. Audacious, intellectual, an icon, rebellious, amazing, brave, iconic. Oh, a couple of different iconic, fantastic, mostly positive. Upset, that's also true. Rebellious. Rebellious is a good one. What is she rebelling against? Well, she's rebelling against societal norms and expectations. Any others? Upset, for sure. Yes, amazing, fantastic, intellectual. Okay, so far, we're all pretty much on Medea's side, even though we know that she's going to do something pretty atrocious. Powerful, that's a really good one. She's a very powerful figure. In fact, later on in the play, she's described as having witch-like powers and is descended from the god of the sun. Vengeful, that's a good one. Um, like in a lot of modern tragedy, revenge is a really key concept, which also raises the question, is she our hero or is she our villain? She's rebelling against society in a sense that's quite admirable, but she does so in one of the most atrocious ways possible. She kills her own children. What are we meant to do with that? Do we support her? Do we hate her? Or are we somehow conflicted? I'm going to show you one more passage from later on in the play, which shows us Medea torn over whether she can bring herself to actually kill her children. She has been told that she must go into exile, but her boys are to stay with Jason in Corinth. This is unacceptable to her, and she deliberates whether she can bring herself to actually murder them or to let them live separated from her. So after reading this passage, I'll give you another few minutes to discuss, and then we'll have a chat about what you think of her. So she says to her children, my children, you have a city and a home in which, leaving your poor mother behind, you will live henceforth, bereft of me. Bereft of you, I shall live out my life in pain and grief. And you will no longer see your mother with loving eyes, but pass into another manner of life. Oh, what is the meaning of your glance at me, children? Why do you smile this last smile of yours? Alas, what am I to do? My courage is gone, ever since I saw the bright faces of the children. I cannot do it. Farewell to my former plans. But what's coming over me? Do I wish to suffer mockery, letting my enemies go unpunished? Must I put up with that? No, it is mere weakness in me even to admit such tender words into my heart. So, remembering that this is the same person that we saw give that kind of feminist speech earlier, have a think about how she's characterized here. Have a chat with the person next to you or in small groups about how she's characterized here, and then type a couple of words into the chat describing her character. So I'll give you 2 or 3 minutes to do that. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to chat with the person next to you about how she's characterized here. We already have some good answers in the chat. Do keep sending them in some more. We also have a very good question here, which is, why did Medea decide to kill her children? Or was it to get rid of all links to Jason? And you're exactly spot on. So in ancient Greece, it was very important to have children, especially sons, so they could become heirs to the family. That's how your heritage gets passed on, and also your glory and your fame. Uh, by killing her own children, Medea is robbing Jason of having these heirs, so his own legacy can't be passed on. So it's an utter form of revenge. Um, some thoughts about how she's characterized here. A couple of people still think she's characterized as strong um, and as quite admirable, even though she's in the midst of debating whether she can commit infanticide. Um, Someone says that she has a good conscience in this part, whereas the bit before she was portrayed as a merciless woman. That's absolutely right. We see her torn between these two states of mind, between revenge and maternal instinct. Um, we've also got some opposing views. Some think she's more stable, and some think she's conflicted. I'd probably say she's conflicted, um, but she doesn't seem as angry as before. You're right. Um, Tanisha says that, oh, sorry, the chat is moving so fast. She's afraid of living separately from them. She's confused as to what she should do, and she generally seems to have had a good heart, but couldn't handle leaving the children without him, or leaving the children with him. So is she here more concerned for the children than her own revenge? That's a good thing to think about. Someone else also says that she's debating the choices of mockery or carrying out the murder of her children, and that's absolutely correct. Greek heroes despise the idea of being mocked. To be mocked or laughed at by your enemies was to be defeated, and Medea shows a lot of those characteristics. Several times throughout the play, she says, "I will not let my enemies get the last laugh, no matter what it takes." She's muddled between her choices, absolutely, and she's scared for them, uh, but just wasn't mentally in the place to make decisions about this. You're right. From the very beginning of the play, we see her absolutely distressed. The first thing we hear is her wailing from behind the scenes, talking about how she no longer wants to live because she's so heartbroken. And we still see that kind of heartbreak here in a slightly different form. Um, Milton has a good point. She's thinking if she should carry out her designs of revenge or let her morals win. That's a really good point. What does morality do in tragedy? Does it have a place? Um, Benjamin says that she doesn't want to be without her children and she doesn't want them to be with Jason and his new bride, but she also doesn't want to kill them because they are her own children. So she's conflicted. Does she do what is best for her children or what she feels she needs to do to get her revenge? Excellent point. She seems to have good intentions, but is acting in rage and not fully thinking about later consequences of her actions. That's a good point. The consequences of committing murder, and especially infanticide, are pretty significant. No city would want to welcome her if they knew she was a murderer. Um, Very good points. So she's a very complex figure, and people have taken different routes to try to understand this. One of the ancient philosophers, Plato, had a theory that the soul was governed by three different forces: reason, emotion, and desire. Those who follow Plato's school of thought believe that in this scene, Medea is torn between different aspects of her soul. When she's determined to kill her children, she's controlled by reason and desire. Her desire is to avenge her husband, and reason tells her that the way to do so is to rob him of what is most precious to him, his children, and his legacy. But when she changes her mind, she's influenced by her maternal emotions. She cannot possibly hurt her own babies. Ultimately, her desire for revenge and her brutal sense of reason wins. Do you think that it's right that she gets away with her crime? What would have been the most just ending? At the end of the play, Medea flies off in a chariot given to her by her grandfather, the sun god, and she goes to Athens, where she's expecting to receive sanctuary. Is that just? What would have been a just ending? Euripides' play came last in the competition out of three. Do you think that this was because it showed someone getting away with murder? These are the kind of questions we need to think about when we study Greek tragedy. A lot of our knowledge of ancient Greek drama comes from reading the text of the plays, but we can also look at other evidence to study the theatrical world. We have already looked at images of the theatre buildings themselves. Other sources we can use include painted pots, walls, and mosaics. These can tell us a lot about what the actors wore and whether they held celebrity status. Looking at this image on the screen, which comes from a fragment of a pot. How can we tell that this is an actor? Take a minute to take a look at it and then type your answers into the chat. What suggests that this man might be an actor? We already have a really good answer here. He's holding a mask and has a costume. Good. So what he's holding in hand is not, thankfully, a decapitated head, but it's a representation of a head, a mask. And what he's wearing is absolutely a costume. The boots that he's wearing, oh good, someone pointed out his shoes. They're very fancy, and these are a particular type of shoes that are worn by actors in tragedy. Someone has also pointed out that he's holding a prop, a knife. If we take a look at the mask, what kind of character do you think he would be portraying? Put any ideas you have in the chat. Oh, someone suggests Zeus. Another person suggests a villain. Interesting. So I suppose two different ends of the spectrum, a god or a powerful character. I like that idea. Pretend I can't see the mask and describe to me what it looks like. A high status character. Yes, good. Someone wealthy. Ooh, nice. So we can actually deduce quite a lot from just a representation of a mask. We can tell from the fact that he has a beard that this is a man. What age range do you think he is? Is he a young man, an older man? What do you think? 60 or so old? 50? Man, yeah, he's got whitish hair as well. He's going grey. What about his expression? Do you think that this is a character from a tragedy or a comedy? What does his expression suggest to us? Serious or blank, a tragedy. He looks very nonchalant, lots of tragedies. Good, yeah. So if you look at the details, his eyebrows are kind of upturned and he looks a bit sad. What about the actor himself? How does he differ from the character he's portraying? Does he look as regal? He looks poor and of less status, exactly. We don't know for sure that he's poor, but he doesn't look particularly wealthy. He's got kind of unkept stubble. He's balding a little bit and got some grey hairs. He looks homeless. Oh, well, he's probably a citizen of relative status if he's an actor. All actors were male Athenian citizens. He's wearing rags. It's difficult to tell here as what he's wearing is a costume, and he's got quite a nice detailed cloak here, and his boots are very fancy. So from this, we think that this is a pretty ordinary guy playing a noble character, perhaps a god, perhaps even Zeus. He's got a sword, which suggests he's got considerable status. Maybe he's a king, maybe he's a general. Why would someone paint this in a pot? Discuss with the person next to you. Who owned this and why would they own it? And if you have any ideas, you can pop them in the chat as well. It's a well-received type of play. That's a good idea. So maybe this is a really famous play that he's performing in. Someone else also suggests that maybe it's a warning. Ooh, what kind of warning are you thinking? To depict the play or part of it? Yeah, so maybe this is owned or bought by someone who really liked the specific play. Have a mortalized part of the play. Yeah, these are all really good ideas. We don't know exactly who the actor on the pot is. A lot of ancient pots actually depicted real people and had their names inscribed above them, which tells us that they are probably quite well-known figures or even celebrities. So even though we don't have this man's name described here, it's possible that this might have actually been an ancient piece of merch that was bought by one of his fans who really liked this particular actor. So maybe in that sense, the ancient Greeks weren't that different from ourselves. Lots of vases had the names of actors and musicians etched into them and were bought as souvenirs. Yeah, and someone suggested in the chat that this is probably owned by someone wealthy who's interested in plays. Absolutely. Attending the theatre was a sign of culture. And having souvenirs from that would show your status, show that you were a refined citizen of ancient society. A good question that's just come in is, was ancient Greek theatre well documented in history for us to know a lot about it? It was documented a bit, so we have lots of sources that write about it. Aristotle is one of our main sources. Even though he's a philosopher, he wrote a whole treatise called the Poetics, where he describes a lot about how ancient theatre worked. And we have lots of ancient scholars who would write in the margins of the plays little facts and trivia about the performance. And in fact, that's where we get one of my favorite facts from. So we learned snippets of information about actors from some of the texts themselves. And this is really one of my favorite fun facts about ancient drama, mostly because it's quite silly. In Aristophanes' comedy The Frogs, he makes fun of a particular tragic actor called Hegelocus. So when Hegelocus was performing a monologue in a tragedy, he must have been a bit out of breath as he mispronounced a line. What he was meant to say translates to, "And from the storm I once again see the calm." But he messed up the line and ended up saying, "From the storm once more I see the weasel." This must have caused the audience to pack out in laughter, and Aristophanes has memorialized this mistake by ridiculing it in one of his comedies. When Dionysus and his slave Xanthias finally cross the river of the underworld and pass by several monsters, Xanthias says to Dionysus, "Cheer up, we've done all right, we may say, just like Hegelocus, and from the storm once more I see the weasel." So, thanks to Aristophanes for making fun of his contemporaries, Hegelocus's embarrassing mistake is still remembered today. And we get lots of little tidbits about ancient theatre passed on through jokes like this, and also by people who were just writing the margins of plays, remembering something that they saw in the theatre. So, as we come to the end of this workshop, let's recap a couple of points that we've covered. Firstly, we have learnt that drama was produced as part of an important annual social, religious, and political festival in various city-states in ancient Greece, most famously in Athens. Secondly, there are a variety of sources that can tell us about ancient theatre, including archaeological sites like extant theatres, pottery depicting actors in stage settings, scripts of ancient plays, and literary commentaries from Greeks like Aristotle. Thirdly, we've noted that while Greek tragedy dramatized myths, the moral issues told throughout these myths were of deep interest to contemporary society. In fact, the resonances of these plays have meant that they continue to be performed, translated, and adapted all over the world, and these plays are very much alive today as they were 2,500 years ago. And finally, ancient drama is just one of the many aspects of the Greek and Roman worlds that you can study within classics. It is an immensely broad subject, which can include poetry and prose, the thought, philosophy, and logic of ancient thinkers, social, cultural, and military history, archaeology and art history, drawing upon paintings, mosaics, pots, coins, buildings, and cities, languages and linguistics, including not only Greek and Latin, but also languages from around the ancient world, and other related subjects like anthropology and gender studies. So if you found this interesting and want to learn more about classics, there are lots of things you can do. Some things I'd recommend, including watching documentaries on the ancient world, like the one I recommended before this session. There are lots available for free on YouTube and on the BBC, like Michael Scott's documentary on ancient theatre and Mary Beard's series on Roman history. Visiting museums is also a fantastic way to engage with the visual culture of antiquity. Museums with large classics collections include the British Museum in London, the Ashmolean in Oxford, the Fitzgerald in Cambridge, just to name a few. There are lots more around the country. You could also have a go reading some pieces of ancient literature. You can find a lot of the plays and poems available for free in English online, or your school library might even have some copies. Lastly, if you are thinking about studying classics, you can explore Oxford's Faculty of Classics website for further resources, and you can come and visit faculties and colleges on open days, where there'll be taster lectures, the chance to speak to current students and tutors, and tons of information. And lastly, Here are some useful links to the Faculty of Classics website and social media pages, and the 2 officers you can contact with any questions about studying at Oxford. But if you have any questions now, I'm very happy to answer them. And I see there's already some in the chat. Someone asks, what careers could this subject lead to? That's a really good question. It can lead to all sorts of careers. So lots of people go into teaching, some people go into journalism and writing, other people follow paths that are completely unrelated, as classics has lots of transferable skills. So I know someone who studied classics and then went on to become a neuroscientist. People can become lawyers. You can do all sorts of things because you learn lots of transferable skills. And that's something that I really like. You can do a degree that's fun and be able to apply the skills you learned to all sorts of careers. Someone else asks, how long is a PhD in classics? Also a good question. So a PhD is usually a minimum of 3 years. Lots of people take 4, even more than that. But before you can do a PhD, you have to do an undergraduate degree and usually a master's degree. Most undergraduate degrees are 3 to 4 years. Some maybe 5 if it includes a year abroad. At some universities it does. The only course at Oxford currently that is 5 years long or 4 years is Classics and Modern Languages. So before you do a PhD, it's likely that you do at least 4 years studying as an undergraduate or as a master's student. But PhDs are really exciting as they're a chance to really explore your own unique interests and you really create your own subject. Does anyone else have any other questions? I know we've only got a few minutes left. If not, then I will hand over to Jack to close the session.
Yeah, it doesn't look like there's any more questions, but I mean, in fairness, we've answered a fair few as we go along. Thank you so much, Leo. That was really interesting listening in, and the audience were clearly very interested in all their questions and the discussion that's been happening. So with that, we'll bring the session to an end. I hope to see you all again next week, where we're going to have a session on animal hibernation. So another right turn into something a bit unrelated, but it should be interesting. And thank you all for listening and paying such attention. And thank you, Leo, for such an interesting session.
Thank you very much.